Well, good morning if you are in Atlanta or New York City or points west of those cities. Good afternoon if you're in Europe. Early good evening if you're in Israel. And good overnight if you're in Asia and parts east of Israel. I'm Fred Plotkin. As you know, this is Fred Plotkin on Fridays. It is December 18th of 2020. And I invite people on this program every week who, in some cases, I know very well. In other cases, like today's guest, we know of one another, but we've not spent much time together. But they always have to be people who I admire, who inspire me, and are doing interesting things. And by that definition, Tomer Zvulun, who is the CEO and artistic director of the Atlanta Opera, fits that description perfectly. So, good morning, Tomer. How are you?
I'm doing great, Fred. Thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. It's I'm going to plunge right into Atlanta as a subject matter because it's something that's been of interest to me for a long time. For people who don't know it, they may think of it as Gone with the Wind. They may think of it as Coca-Cola. They may think of it as Delta Airlines, CNN. They may think of it as corporations, as big business. It is also one of the most important cities in the civil rights movement in the United States and therefore the world. Martin Luther King preached in Atlanta. There, John Lewis, the great congressman who recently died, was not born in Atlanta, but represented Atlanta. It's a very diverse city. It has the largest airport in the world. Um, I have been to Atlanta many, 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 many times at the airport, only once in the city for a wonderful week we'll talk about. And it is a city that in 1996 had the Olympics, something that New York City has never had, to my great regret. And therefore, it has seen itself as a world city. It has burned to the ground and been rebuilt. It is full of people with initiative. Historically, there was huge racism and prejudice, and there have been good governors and bad governors and very interesting mayors in Atlanta. The mayor of Atlanta, always first a man, and then there have been a couple of women, three women, I think, have always gone on to national prominence. So Atlanta is a place that tends to put people on the world stage. And yet, and this is my opinion, Tomer, it's a city that until very recently has not stood up as regards opera. You're changing that. But I'm going to tell you now a story I know you don't know. In the 1990s, I was approached by a very important American think tank to do a case study on a city and an opera company that I felt had the most room to grow. And we should say about Atlanta that Atlanta was one of the most important stops on the Metropolitan Opera tour every spring. And the entire city turned out and was very hospitable to the Met. And when I worked at the Met, I decided one year to go out on the tour specifically to Atlanta, and that was 1986. And it was a magnificent week. I could just leave it at that. So I saw that there was a love of opera and a cultured community, and um, racially, although the city has had divisions, there is cohesion in ways there that you don't see in other southern and frankly northern cities in the United States. And many wonderful singers and musicians came from Atlanta and do come from Atlanta. It's a city that has a fantastic orchestra and chorus. The Atlanta Symphony is really a remarkable institution. So therefore, the makings were there. The corporate money was there. Atlanta has many more Fortune 500 corporations than Philadelphia, for example, which has a great orchestra and a very fine opera company. But Philadelphia has to struggle financially in a way that Atlanta should not have to struggle in terms of the arts. And so this foundation, this think tank, came to me and they said, what is the city that is most underserved by opera in the United States? And I said, Atlanta. They said, explain. And I said, well, the year this was 1994. I said, there are more opera performances each year in Roanoke, Virginia, in Anchorage, Alaska, and I named a series of small to medium-sized American cities than there are in Atlanta, with all of Atlanta's advantages, and it's about to have the Olympics, as I mentioned. And I said to this foundation that I think that the city we have to study is Atlanta. Unfortunately, what the foundation wanted, and what I sort of believed, I should call them a think tank, were different. They wanted to prove that opera can make money, and that I should create a model for Atlanta where opera would make a profit. And I tried to explain that we don't go into opera to make a profit. We try to meet the bottom line and not be in debt. But opera is by its nature not a profit-making institution. It's not an airline. It's not selling Coca-Cola. And therefore, I felt that the model that could be explored for Atlanta would be a new model for it. So ultimately, the think tank and I decided not to do this, but I've always kept my eye on Atlanta. And for many years, not much happened. And then 7 years ago, you arrived, Tomer, and so much of what I would want to see for Atlanta, you've done. You and I have never discussed this. So it's not that I tried to influence you. It's just I've been watching. And it's a wonderful thing to observe, because you are helping Atlanta fulfill its potential to be a cultural capital, not just in the United States, but in the world. So what do you think of that?
That's amazing. And I just love the perspective that you bring to it all. Also, before we went live, we realized how much in common we have in the years that we spent at the Metropolitan Opera. And I think that one of the reasons that Atlanta has always struggled finding a place in the world of opera is the big shadow of the Metropolitan Opera. And as somebody who spent years at the Metropolitan Opera, I have a feeling that I know more about that, which helps me a lot. So what do I mean by that? For years, there was the Metropolitan Opera Tour, and it was such an incredible tradition. I mean, some of the books in my library are about those tours, about the phenomenal performances and the amazing singers that have been performing here.
Yeah.
And so I think it was in 1986, if I remember the details correctly, that the Met stopped touring.
Yes, that's why I came in 1986 to be on the last tour.
There you go. And
Yeah.
so then at around that time, a few years earlier in the 1980, 1979, 1980, a small opera company was formed, the Atlanta Opera. And for 6 years, it had to compete with the likes of Domingo Pavarotti, Tecanoa, all those singers coming here with millions and millions of dollars of budget. And it had to be this David against this Goliath. And the experience of opera, not only from a performance standpoint, but also the social aspect of it, the glamour of it all, the parties. It's Atlanta, it's the South.
Yeah.
That opera company had to compete with that Goliath. And that shadow has been over this company for 40 years. And when I arrived, and remember that I arrived after working here for a few years. I arrived in 2013 after having worked here as a stage director in 4 productions from 2005 through 2011. So I've been observing the difficulties that the opera company had in reaching out to the community vis-a-vis the challenge of that shadow. Luckily, I believe that we have reached a place where there's no more comparison, or there's very few people that remember the glory days. And we have what we call a blue ocean. We can do whatever we want now, which is incredible.
I agree with you, but I would only push back in one way. that other cities on the Metropolitan Opera Tour developed opera traditions much earlier. So, for example, Dallas founded their opera company in 1957, as opposed to 1979. Minneapolis, where you've worked, has a long tradition of opera, even though every year they got a Met visit. So there are some cities like Boston and Cleveland that never really developed an opera tradition, unfortunately, but others absolutely did. So I always ask myself, why Atlanta? For people who are not Americans who are listening, I want to make a particular point. I'm a New Yorker, no secret about that. The two cities in the United States that have always compared themselves to New York are not Chicago and Los Angeles, but Atlanta and Dallas, because they have looked to New York as money, power, beacons of culture, and tried to do everything they could to outdo New York that way. So, for example, when Dallas and Fort Worth nearby, there was a Michelangelo that was discovered a few years ago that was restored at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. When the museum in Fort Worth outbid the Metropolitan Museum to get the Michelangelo, we in New York grieved, and we understood that that was that mentality that they have, which I'm not criticizing at all. It's a great thing. Similarly, in Atlanta, when Atlanta was able to have a branch of the Louvre Museum and have exchanges with Paris, when Atlanta gets a flight nonstop to Venice or Rome or Munich or Vienna before New York does, it's in comparison to New York. So that's why I've always found it interesting that Dallas stepped up very early to try to have an opera company that rivals New York. And nothing rivals the Met, but Dallas has an excellent company, really outstanding. And Atlanta was late until you, frankly. Why do you think it didn't happen before? Apart from the Met tour, but given the mentality, the business orientation of Atlanta, the desire to be a world city, the ability to have great museums and a fantastic symphony orchestra, why was an opera company, a big opera company, a bit delayed?
I think it has to do with two components. One is vision, and the other is the place of the organization in the landscape of the city. So what do I mean by that? Vision, or how do we approach ourselves, which you alluded to, competition and wanting to be like New York. Good luck with that. And I think it was Oscar Wilde that said, just be yourself, everybody else is already taken. So that is so connected to this idea of vision and what do we think of ourselves. I spent quite a few years working for the Met and it was amazing. I don't want to be the Met. I really don't. I revere them and admire them greatly. It's the greatest orchestra. It's the greatest chorus. It's a different animal with different metabolism. We are who we are here. And by defining what that is and thinking about that, and I'm happy to unpack a little more about what is our vision? What do we want? That's a critical aspect of it all. So we're not trying to compete with anybody. That's number one. Number two is the place that an organization holds in the fabric of the city. So you mentioned two cities, Cleveland and Boston. And you said that those opera companies somehow never achieved what Dallas and maybe Houston and other big companies achieved. And I think that that has to do with the place that the competing organization, the symphony or the orchestra has, because Cleveland, the resources of the community, and I worked in Opera Cleveland before it went bankrupt, the focus, the jewel of the city is the Cleveland Orchestra. I worked
and its concert hall.
And its concert hall, the Severance Hall.
Yeah.
And the focus of Boston, and I adore Boston. Boston Lyric Opera is a great company, but the focus of Bostonians is Boston Symphony. And it's to some extent, it happened in Philadelphia too. The focus was not the Philadelphia Opera, it was the Philadelphia Orchestra. As opposed to other cities that view their orchestra and opera in a kind of an even way. And you can look at Houston, you can look at Dallas, both have great opera companies, great symphonies. And what happened, and I think Philadelphia is a good example that is analogous to Atlanta, is that when the vision changed, David Devan came, the perception changed in terms of the jewel of the city. And now the orchestra and the opera have somewhat of a similar stature, and that's the way it should be. And I think that, step by step, the Atlanta Symphony is an incredible organization. There is no reason in the world why a city will not have a few jewels in the crown. And that's what we're after.
Let's plunge right into a lot of the work you've done. Well, I'm going to start with your background is that you were born in Israel, but not in Tel Aviv and not in Jerusalem. I was chatting with an Israeli friend of mine the other day, and she said, I have a question for him. She said, everyone I've known who's been in the army has helped them along in their careers if they wanted to study and do things. And she mentioned a mathematician and a scientist and a doctor and so on. And I thought to myself, well, I know that Tomer prepared to be a medic in the army, but could the Israeli army have helped you become an opera person, opera director? Did they have
Absolutely.
that too?
I mean, my time in the military was incredible in terms of forming who I am, the leadership, the understanding of working with people, managing a team, working toward a goal, and being very disciplined when it comes to achieving those goals. So it's a huge part of who I am today.
And I know that you saw Ingmar Bergman's film, The Magic Flute, and that's what sort of captured your attention. But you came to North America primarily, to Boston and then later New York, to study, to develop your opera knowledge and your skills and so on. Where did you direct your first opera?
So I directed my first opera in this metropolis of Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I was, at the time, I was working in Seattle Opera with the amazing Spade Jenkins, who influenced me greatly. And I was assisting great directors as an apprentice, working with folks like Stephen Wadsworth, Peter Cazares, Chris Alexander, many others. And this opportunity came to direct Marriage of Figaro. And actually, it was not too long ago. I mean, it was back in 2006. And that was my first big production. And, it's all been like a Cinderella story from then on. It's just been incredible. The next year, I ended up at the Metropolitan Opera because Seattle Opera did a co-production, Iphigénie en Tauride.
Which was a wonderful production. I had one set design issue, but basically it was a wonderful production. I'll tell you my set design issue. From the house, if you're looking at house left, stage right, there was sort of a little room or a compartment. And what happened in that room was not visible to half the audience.
We're deeply aware of that. And
Okay.
that's too bad. I mean, what is brilliant about Tom Lynch design and Stephen Wadsworth production is that the chorus is always on stage. And Iphigénie en Tauride is a story that takes place in this society where the priestesses are the fabric of the community. They're so important to everything that is going on between Iphigénie and Oreste. And Stephen had this incredible vision of constant ceremony, rituals that are going on in many places on stage. And unfortunately, Stage Right had the sightline issue. It was not an issue in Seattle because it was a co-production between Seattle Opera and the Met. And when we arrived at the Met, we realized that that was a challenge.
Well, that said, I adored the production. I am a huge fan of Susan Graham, who played Iphigénie, and we had Domingo and we had Paul Groves. It was a fantastic cast and just a thrill. I went constantly. I think if there were 5 or 6, I went to all 5 or 6 of them.
But can I tell you a story about that? Because that,
Yeah.
That was my first day at the Metropolitan Opera. Was in October of 2007, and I'm this 31-year-old kid coming from Seattle Opera, where it was the co-production was there. And as often happens at the Met, you don't have time. There's 30 productions going on. And so you have to, if you're directing the show, you have to divide and conquer. And so what Stephen did, he realized that there's so many details and so many chorus scenes in the show. And my first day at the Met, he said, okay, you're taking the guys I'm taking the girls. You're going to direct the Metropolitan Opera course, men course, and I'm going to go to the other room and work with the women. See you later. So I come to my first rehearsal at the Met. And of course, in the men's chorus scene is the big, beautiful, I call it the love duet between Oreste and Pilad. And who's singing Oreste, Plácido Domingo, who I've been, idolizing for many years. And he is in the room. I meet him for the first time. And as a 30-year-old kid, I start to direct him. And I was speechless. It doesn't happen very often, but I was speechless. And but then it passed, and we just went through it all. And one thing I'll never forget is that at the end of the rehearsal, once you stage everything, there is a chorus scene, Oreste entrance aria, and then another chorus scene. And we staged everything, and then we had to run it at the end of the rehearsal. And I looked at the clock, and I realized I finished the first chorus scene. Plácido was starting to sing his aria, and I didn't have enough time to do the whole thing. So I had to stop Plácido's aria and say, okay, we're jumping to the next chorus scene. And then I turned to the stage manager and I said, I just stopped Plácido Domingo from singing an aria. And he said, it's okay. It's really okay. That's what we do here.
Well, Domingo is such a complete man of the theater, as someone who has conducted and began as a child in with his parents in companies. And he's been an executive director of opera companies. He fully understands timing, budget, union issues, and all of that. So I'm sure that he had no issue with that. And as you know, he is incredibly supportive of young people starting out in opera, so that that would have been fine. And it's a wonderful thing. He similarly with me was very encouraging in a lot of ways, and wrote the introduction to one of my books. And therefore he's it in terms of respecting the necessities of the opera world in terms of
absolutely
making
absolutely.
it work.
The most charming man I've met in a long time. He started his career, by the way, in Israel, singing
Yes, I know.
quite a few operas in Hebrew, because at the time that was the custom. And so when I met him and he heard, oh, you're Israeli. Okay. I sang Pearl Fishers and Onegin in Hebrew. And then he immediately starts singing. Of course, he remembers everything. He started singing an aria from Onegin in Hebrew. So
he's sung in Chinese. There's really no one like him at all. But that's for another time. I want to talk about you and about Atlanta. Listeners know that I always ask my guests to select a few works or moments from an opera or symphonic or other music. And Tomer very specifically chose works that relate to the development of his career, and I would guess that speak to you in personal ways. So we have Fliegender Holländer, we have Iphigenie und Tauride, as we just discussed. We have the finale of Don Giovanni. We have Lucia di Lammermoor, but not the mad scene, and not the tenor arias at the end, and not the duet in Act 1, but Appresa di Lucia, the scene in the second act, where Enrico, her brother, tells Lucia in effect that she will have to marry Arturo, who she doesn't want to marry, rather than Edgardo, who she does want to marry. There were two other picks I'm going to talk about in a moment, but why that scene of Lucia?
First of all, I love Lucia, and I was lucky enough to do Lucia so many times. And what always blew with some amazing singers that I'd love to tell some anecdotes about all of them. But what always blew my mind was when Lucia really picks up for me is Act 2. I love bel canto, but as a director, it's challenging sometimes, because it's so much about the singing, and it's less about the interpretation and the deep understanding of characters. And what happens in Act 2 of Lucia is a little bit different. And to me, it almost feels verismo, dramatically, because it's so fleshed out, and it's the relationship between the brother and Lucia, Enrico and Lucia. And then the whole storyline moving forward into the contract and the marriage, and Edgardo bursting into it, that it feels veristic to me. And I adore directing that scene. Plus, it's great music.
And who was your first Lucia and Enrico?
So there were a few. There were quite a few. And the first one was when I was an AD at the Met. And it was Diana Damerau in her first Lucia, which was incredible. And so the other person I studied, because I came into the production in 2007, was Natalie Dessay, who was just heartbreaking. And then Diana doing it and watching her thinking about every note in the mat scene and motivating every note really informed me in how to interpret those kinds of pieces. And then when I directed my own productions, I had in Seattle an amazing singer who will always be seared in my mind as the definitive Lucia. And there was Alexandra Kujak.
Yes.
Who is divine. And what was really great about Alexandra is that we worked on the mat scene just on every little bit. And what I loved about her is that you never knew what she's going to actually do, because she had a vocabulary and she worked it with the chorus so that it was always fresh. And every performance was like you were on the edge of the seat because you didn't know what she's going to do, who she's going to go to. And it all made sense and sounded incredible. It was the best performance. And I've seen so many performances. It's the best performances that I've ever seen was Alexandra's Lucia.
Well, here's an issue because you were talking about bel canto. I'm older than you are, and I began going to opera when I was very, 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 very young. As in, I was not yet 3 years old when I went to my first opera. So I've been going for a very long time, and I had seen performances of Lucia, of course, Roberta Peters, Beverly Sills, Joan Sutherland, but the first time that I was involved in a production was Joan Sutherland.
Wow.
But it was not the Joan Sutherland who began with Franco Zeffirelli in the 1960s. It was Joan Sutherland around 1982 with Alfredo Kraus, when both of them were veteran artists. And by many people's points of view, but not mine, way too old to sing those roles. And what was astonishing to me about both Sutherland and Kraus was the degree to which musically they were sovereign, but how they added more to their performances because they were so at home in the roles, that rather than do what some artists and people in every profession do, is just sit back and say, I know how to do this, they went deeper. So Sutherland's acting was actually very fine in that 1982 performance. And it can be seen on video. And during the mad scene, when she suddenly sees something, she goes running toward it. And she was barefoot. Now, the old Met production had not too many steps, but it had a few steps. And I knew that Miss Sutherland had to look down every so often so as not to fall during her mad scene. And the way that she would look down but keep singing by keeping her head high, but the eyes down, the audience believed that she was looking up at the sky, but her eyes were actually flicking down all the time. All of this while doing trills, all of this while running around the stage at the age of 56. Mr. Kraus did not run around the stage at all. He stood there and sang magnificently well. And the lesson for me was, I believe that there are different ways to act in opera, and that's where I want to go with you, because I've seen productions of yours in different cities, although we've never spoken about it. And you're a terrific director of acting in addition to staging in opera. But Miss Sutherland and Mr. Kraus were not known as actors, although I thought that they were very fine actors. But our notion of what acting is now in opera is very different than it was 30, 40, not to mention 60 years ago, even though opera has always had great actors. Always. How do you, specifically for bel canto, but just in general, approach acting now for opera?
Well, I think, there's two different and widely different approaches to opera. One is focusing solely on the music and the voice. and saying that's enough. Like, that's the most important thing. Prima la musica. The other one is approaching opera as a complete art form where the drama, the visuals, the wigs and makeup, the lights, the projections, the acting, everything is a Gesamtkunstwerk. That's what I subscribe to. And the people that I like to work with, and Michael Mays is a great example, Alexander Kujak, are people that understand the importance of the character, delving into the scene, people that are curious about it, people that don't say, I know the piece. Because the minute that you say, I know the piece, you're close to really understanding it and interpreting it, because we're always different. And so I always approach it as a complete artwork that focuses on the scene and on the drama, plus the music. And the music is a very important cornerstone in it, but it's not only that. And one of the things that are difficult about bel canto operas versus, let's say, Dead Man Walking or Silent Night, new pieces, is that there is a tendency of some singers to believe that singing is enough and they're just there for singing. When in fact, the audience today will not accept the artifice of, I stand here and I sound glorious, please adore me. That is no longer the case in 2021.
I happen to know, because I did my research, that you, like me, are a huge fan of cinema.
Yeah.
And from your earliest days in Israel, when you didn't necessarily go to a lot of opera, you saw a lot of film. And I imagine that being in Israel, which has a large European element to the population, in addition to the Middle Eastern and the African and so forth, that there was not just the big American films, but there were also films from all over the world.
Sure.
And you were able to see them. And I know that one director who inspired you a fair amount is someone I knew and worked with a lot, with Federico Fellini.
Oh my God, you really?
I worked with him a lot. Yeah. And this year 2020 would have been his 100th birthday.
Oh.
And initially I was involved in a project that would have brought back all of his films and I would have taught classes on it, but the pandemic took care of that. But I was very pleased, impressed to see that the first Fellini film that I ever saw is one of your favorites, namely Roma.
Uh-huh.
Because it's not a film that people cite when they talk about Fellini. They talk about La Strada, which I love, and La Dolce Vita, and 8½, and Amarcord, which you also love, I know. What was it about Roma that you loved? That
it's always about what for me, about Fellini, it's always the understanding of human beings and getting into their psychology and families. And so showing that family eating pasta, and I believe everything about them, and the way the little boy is obsessed with girls and he's going to school, and the teacher is so specific in the way his character.
Wait a minute, is that Amarcord or Roma?
This is Amarcord, but both of them to me brings different aspects of his biography and his childhood. Actually, all of his film, but really Amarcord and Roma are the top in that regard. And then, but then most importantly, is that he always figures out a way to go in a surreal psychological way that tells me so much about the people and then the society. Because Roma has this incredible moment where they're discovering in the cave, when they go into the cave and discovering this, what is underneath the surface, which to me is an analogy to what we do as directors. We dig underneath to find what motivates those characters. That's the metaphor for all of his work.
That is my favorite scene in the movie. And I'm going to send you a video. Someone interviewed me a few years ago and he asked me about what influenced me in cinema and art. And I said Roma, and specifically that scene where they're building the Rome subway, they're extending it, and they discover these paintings from ancient Rome that when the air of modern times comes in, the paintings vanish and the faces disappear. It was the most extraordinary scene
It's amazing.
in
And,
cinema.
but it's so richly symbolic to
Yeah.
everything,
Yeah.
and, going back to childhood in Israel and films and opera, films is what really led me to understand the power of music as a storyteller. So, you mentioned Fellini, and obviously Nino Rota is the great composer that worked with him, but Alfred Hitchcock and Bernard Herrmann is a great example. Steven Spielberg and John Williams. And so my first operas, because we didn't have an opera house to go to at the age of 3, unfortunately, not that my parents could take me there, but my operas were Indiana Jones and the music of John Williams, was Jaws, the same story, was Fellini Amarcord, was Hitchcock Rear Window and North by Northwest.
Vertigo.
Vertigo. I mean, that's when I realized how much music, how much power it has. So then when I attended my first opera, I was like, all right, I'm not going to medical school. This is it. This is amazing. And I've never regretted that, because it is the most complete art form that exists. And now we're lucky enough to transpose those operatic performances on stage and capture them on film. And today, by the way, is a big day for us, because
I'm going to get there in a moment, but I did want to talk about film a little more and so on.
Yeah.
When I teach opera, which I do a lot, often the way in is film. And I explain to people that film is the outgrowth of opera, that it took many of the elements of opera that were on a stage and put them on a screen. But to me, the big difference is in film, the word comes first. In opera, despite what you said, I believe the music comes first and the words are very important, and the imagery too. But with film, we can look at the pictures and hear the words and know what's going on. Music adds an incredible amount, but it's secondary, I think. I don't know what you think in film, whereas in opera, if you can't sing and if the orchestra can't play, you don't really have an opera, you have a play, you have theater.
Yeah. My wife's favorite question is, what is your favorite? What is your favorite flavor? We have ice cream, and she says, what is your favorite flavor? Or what is your favorite dish? And, I always answer the same, which frustrates the hell out of her. And I say, I like the combination. So why would we have to choose what is more important? I believe that in opera and in film, actually, all the elements are just as important. And as a director, or an artistic director, you have to calculate all those elements, because focusing on one of them is going to make the body not completely coordinated. And that's what I feel like my work as a director is based on.
And now, if you will, talk about what Atlanta Opera has announced.
So we're launching Spotlight Media, which is our new initiative. It takes all the productions that we've done in the fall, which is a whole new story that we can talk about, performing during a pandemic. Kaiser from Atlantis, Pagliacci, talk about Fellini, because that could be another segue. But all that we've done is captured via film in a high definition. We're working with a fantastic filmmaker that is now the resident filmmaker for us, Felipe Barral, and our wonderful director of marketing, Ashley Mirakian, created this platform where all the films are going to be hosted and available for people to watch all over the world.
Well, the first thing I want to say is, in watching some of the stuff you sent me and that I've looked at on my own, that is some of the most outstanding filmmaking. I had to look up who Felipe is, because it's of a quality, frankly, so much higher than most opera broadcasting. My issue with opera broadcasting is the filmmaking. Yeah. When I say broadcasting, I don't mean radio, I mean visual. I go crazy at the bad quality of so much of the filmmaking, and yet the quality, who is this person and where did you find him?
Well, he was a CNN videographer, and I met him for the first time, and I knew this guy is a deep, serious artist. and it comes from passion. You know, he was listening to everything. It was an interview with another organization in Atlanta, and he asked the right question. He was so interested. He's a musician and he's a storyteller. And so we had this meeting of the minds, and I'm a strong believer in meeting of the minds. And so we started working together as much as I could hire him to do documentaries and promos. And then when the pandemic started, the first thing that we had to do was really figure out a way to capture everything that we do now and that we will do in the future and broadcast it to people so they can watch it safely at home. And that is actually never waste a crisis is what I call it, because I've always wanted to develop that, but I didn't have time or bandwidth, but now we had to do it. And it's been very exciting to work with him because he has a very specific style. I think often when I look at his work about Martin Scorsese, who is always using camera to go around and get in people's faces. And Felipe is not shy about getting in your face in the middle of a rehearsal or performance. And that's connected to what you said, Fred, is that I can't watch opera on HD as well. It feels to me as if we are trying to replace the live performance, which is irreplaceable, with something else. When in fact, what we really need to do is find another language that is parallel to the live performance. You cannot replicate the live performance, so give it up. Let's try to come up with a different product. And that's what he's doing.
I kind of agree with you. And as I said, I was completely blown away by the quality of this man's work, who I didn't know.
Yeah.
And that it was a revelation to me to see it. But I would only disagree with you to the extent that I think it's possible with the right director to create, and I mean film director, to create opera films that give a sense of the theater and of the live performance. I'll name specifically one and then another. The one is Brian Large.
Oh, yeah.
Brian Large for decades has made opera films of an outstanding quality. He did many things at the Met, but not only. Most famously, the Ring Cycle, the Otto Schenk, Gunther Schneider, Ziemßen Ring Cycle from the 80s. And it was controversial in his time when he put a camera on the stage to capture Hildegard Behrens as Brunhilde reacting to James Morris's Wotan, telling her that she's losing her godly powers and has to be put to rest until someone comes and wakes her up. And at the time, there was huge debate about the fact that you can't put a camera on the stage. That's not what the audience sees. And Brian said, I mostly agree, but in this case, we have to understand the story. And Brian Large, more than any director I've seen for opera film, follows the music and knows where the intentions are. We have many directors now who treat it as if it were a sports event. And, you know, here's this face and that face and back and forth. And it's horrible to look at. With Brian Large, he looks at the libretto and the music and he tells the story. And I've not seen yet enough of Felipe's work from Atlanta, but everything I've seen is storytelling, but it's not invasive. It's not the film director trying to express his view and style. It's honoring the work. And I mean, I know Pagliacci quite well, and I didn't know the other work you sent, and I wanted to look at it. But clearly, he has something. So I think that, yes, we do have to follow the music. And yes, making an opera film is not the same as showing an opera performance from the theater. I studied with Tito Gobbi, and he acted in many Italian films as an actor. And he told me that his acting as an opera performer, and then later as a stage director, was very different from his film acting, and he understood the difference. And even when he did opera on film, he acted in the opera style and not in the cinema style. What do you think?
I think, first of all, that's fascinating. Let's start with Brian Large. I'm a huge fan of his work. And I think it's connected to exactly what you said. You got to find people that are passionate about this art form, that understand the importance of it, and not corporate people that will tell it as if, let's make sure that the audience doesn't get bored. I think that that's the problem with a lot of people that don't understand this art form. So they think, oh, it's boring, she's singing an aria. The aria is amazing. Figure out a way to add something to the depth of it, rather than trying to have different editing tricks that will distract us. Brian gets that, Felipe gets that. Now, I think cinema informs opera acting. And there's no question about that. From the moment that singers at the Met, during the time that I was there, realized that there's Met on HD, their acting, their thinking changed. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget working with Angela Gheorghiu and Roberto Alagna on La Rondine, is that famous production, staging that final scene, incredible, heartbreaking scene when they're saying goodbye. Life imitates art, art imitates life. And Angela, who's done the show before in Covent Garden and was reprising it in the Met, was asking the director to change the angles, because she's a very smart lady, and she knew that the angle of the camera is going to be from below, and she wanted to look good. And so the staging originally is that Ruggiero holds her, goes on his knees and holds her, and she stands up like this. And she knew that if the camera is going to be below, that's not going to be a very flattering angle. So she asked him to change it. Before the HD broadcast, she thought about it. Intelligent actors, intelligent singers think about all those things. Mm-hmm. And I think it informs it. And I don't think there's look, it all has to do with artifice, right? And we talked about bel canto and the artifice that some singers believe that can save them or can come on account of being real. And so that goes into the acting style in films. I don't think there's a room to do all those old-fashioned gestures in film anymore, because the audience is smart.
So here's the theory I've had. The characters of Rodolfo and Musetta in La Bohème become Magda and Ruggiero in La Rondine. They're the same people. They're the survivors from Bohème about 20 years on. And this is the people they've become.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, I can see that. What happened to Marcello, poor guy?
She left him.
And so
Marcello is painting walls in Paris.
Somewhere. Yeah. I love that.
So, and on a similar vein, and then I want to get right to you being a CEO, is when I discuss this with Fellini. So when I teach it, it's based on what Fellini said to me. I wrote an article about this maybe 15 years ago about how I saw in La Strada the influence of Pagliacci.
Amen.
And
no question about it.
Denied it. And then Giulietta Messina said to me, of course he's going to deny it, but absolutely it was La Strada. Because very down to the fact that the Anthony Quinn character is named Zampano. And i Zampognati in Italian are the shepherds who travel the countryside playing their horns. And we have the Zampognati in Pagliacci, and we have the Zampognati also in Tosca. We don't see them, we hear them in the last act of Tosca. Mm-hmm. And so Fellini ultimately said to me, yes, of course, there was that influence. And to me, it is the most classic example I can think of in all of opera and cinema showing the direct influence, not Pretty Woman, not Moonstruck, wonderful though those films are. But this is the one that captures the essence of opera more than Rent for Bohème. This is the one.
Oh, I could not agree more.
It's the most emotionally operatic.
And the fact that you worked with him, we're gonna have
a lot
conversation. He's a
lot. I mean, not just once, a lot for years.
How was he? What kind of he must have been a very warm person.
He was. I don't want to in any way mischaracterize him. I loved him. He was not warm. He was human. He was humane, but he kept a lot to himself. and he needed to be off on his own a lot. And Messina, his wife Giulietta Messina, understood, you just let Federico be.
Yeah.
And so often they lived on Via Margutta in Rome, and I was often at their apartment, and I would sit with her, and Federico would go off where he would go. And I don't mean to another place, he'd go into another room only and draw or think or whatever happened in his genius mind, and then would come out and sit down and, talk about the color of my shirt, but in the most banal way. But you just knew that whatever it was about the color of my shirt was not about me. It was about something he was going to do with that blue color in some place at some time. He
Amazing.
was a permanent creative artist. He was fascinating, and I adored him. But it was the people around him. And I mean Nino Rota, Marcello Mastroianni, Giulietta Messina, who understood that and let him be who he was. Because otherwise that would not have happened. What he achieved would not have happened, I think.
Yeah, that just blows my mind. And, going back to Pagliacci and La Strada, I have here in my office a TV, and Criterion Collection is, there's a new app, thank God, and stuff is going on. And when I was preparing that, Pagliacci La Strada was going on a lot. There is something that he captured there that is so profound. And going back to this idea of doing Pagliacci in a tent, there was something practical about it, because we had to be outside and we had to be safe because
I'll just say very quickly, during the pandemic, or we're still in it, but in the fall, the Atlanta Opera, when most opera came to a grinding halt in America, the Atlanta Opera built a tent and went out and did opera outside, and singers wore masks, and you made opera happen despite everything. How did you do that? And what did you have to adapt? And explain how you made this happen, which is remarkable.
Well, I mean, I was just about to say that that's the practical aspect of it. Necessity is the mother of invention. So we knew that from a safety standpoint, we had to be outside. But then I realized, when I was thinking about the shows that we wanted to do, that there was something about the ethos of those shows. This is this terrible cliche, the show must go on. But the cliche comes for something real. And by the way, it was invented in a circus, the show must go on, because a stampede of, according to an urban myth, a stampede of animals went out, and the ringmaster said, show must go on. But there is something about the perseverance of a circus performer, the stubbornness. And it doesn't matter when you look at history, the Great Depression or World War, circus players figured out a way, just like many artists, to make sure that the show is going to go on.
Mm-hmm.
And that ethos of a circus was this metaphor for us. So doing Pagliacci is a no-brainer in a circus, right? I mean, you don't have to be a creative genius to do that. Kaiser from Atlantis was a real struggle and question of how do you connect that thematically. And when you look at the story and how it was premiered, this is a piece written by Victor Ullmann during the Holocaust in a camp in Terezin. And those people, despite everything going on in the world, it was not a pandemic, it was a world war, they figured out a way to tell their stories. The artists that we had in Atlanta Opera figured out a way to tell their stories during this pandemic. And that's what I'm proud of, and that's the story that those productions are capturing. Is not only the story of Canio and the Kaiser and death, it's the story of a company and the ethos of the show must go on.
You mentioned in passing Theresienstadt, which was in the Czech Republic. That place was famous because allegedly it was where the arts could be fostered and performed. And it was sort of a show camp when dignitaries would come visit to see that. Her name was Fania Fenelon, I think, was the violinist who Vanessa Redgrave played in a film called Playing for Life or Playing for Time, I think. One of the most influential books I ever read as a small child was called I Never Saw Another Butterfly, which was a collection of poems. You have it.
I have it
And then
right
there's
here.
another one called In Memory's Kitchen, which is a gathering of well, it's a long story. It involves Israel and so on, of the conversations that the Jewish women in Theresienstadt had about their culture, about their history, about passing on the memory of what they ate in their kitchens and the lives they led in the family meals. They got passed on, and it wound up as a document in Israel. And then a dear friend of mine in New York found it, edited it, and had it translated, and is now out in the world as a document of the culture of Theresienstadt and of a lost civilization. I completely get it about the show must go on. And I'm mindful of your time. You can tell me if you want to extend, but we have about 5 more minutes. And I want to ask you about, there are many fine stage directors and there are many fine CEOs of opera company, and there are many who are terrible. But not too many people do both. I knew Nicolas Joel, who was a stage director, and he ran the Paris Opera for a while, and there are a few, but those are different hats. Those are different rooms in a theater practically, and have different requirements. The CEO has to make tough decisions that are often imposed on the stage director and on the conductor and the orchestra, the chorus, and the soloist. But both of them have to foster an environment of happy collegial working, sometimes with limited resources, even without a pandemic. So they asked you in Atlanta to do both, which is great. How did that happen that they asked you to do both? And how do you do both?
Okay, so good question. I think they asked me to do both because they realized that you can't separate the two. And that's what I believe. And I realize that I may be a minority. But the way that it works in this world, especially in America, where fundraising is so important, is that I strongly believe that fundraising and sales, which fundraising is connected to that, selling tickets is sales, all this stuff is sales. What we're doing right now is sales. Sales is connected to the art. You can't have somebody in a suit who's not necessarily from the art, that doesn't feel passionately about it, have him be your salesperson and ask for money. It's hard. I mean, you can do that, but sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. And I think that people that can do both, and again, prima la parola, prima la musica, why choose? People that can do both are able to propel their passion and their knowledge about art and translate it into sales. And Francesca Zambello, who I think is fantastic, is able to do that as well. And I think there are more examples of that. But I found that this belief that you have to separate the two because the artistic director is going to want to spend more money, and the chief financial officer or the executive director, his job is to be the person who will say no to him, that is absolute BS. I'm sorry, I don't subscribe to that. I think often they get in trouble because there's a competition of ego. And what I do is I surround myself by an incredible team of professionals that know a lot more than I do about finance, about marketing, about development. And I trust them to tell me what I need to do if I need to scale down my vision, or I need to keep my vision and go raise some more money. So that's the way I go about it. Now, in relation to the CEO part, when I took over, I had no business taking over as a CEO. I knew how to direct. I knew how to stage manage. I had a innate feeling of business, but I didn't have the vocabulary. I didn't have the credentials to actually do that, manage people, look at financial statements, convince a board of directors of a strategic path. And my board of directors has been incredibly supportive. And one of the things that they did was send me to Harvard Business School to get an executive MBA, a program of leadership development that really changed my life, changed my world. And in it, it's a year-long, on and off campus, a bunch of CEOs and executives, not from the arts, actually. A lot of my colleagues are from the for-profit. And what it did is that it allowed me to understand, and more importantly, acquire the vernacular and the vocabulary to communicate with business people about strategy, marketing, leadership, etc. And for that, I will forever be grateful to my board, because I believe that it added a tool that is very necessary for my success and the organization's.
I have a very dear friend who ran an outstanding ballet company, and he too was sent to the Harvard Business School, and it changed his world. And he did an outstanding job as a result. I was talking about you as a stage director and CEO, and I realized that in many opera companies, the two jobs are artistic director, but the artistic director has often been a conductor rather than a stage director. So this is a bit unusual. That's why I mentioned Nicolas Joel in Paris as an example. We cannot end this without mentioning two more things. One of them is Silent Night, a magnificent opera. A couple of weeks ago, I had Mark Campbell on as my guest, and Kevin Putz wrote the music. It won the Pulitzer Prize.
Right.
I don't know if you're familiar with an article I publish at the end of every year called the Excellence in Opera Awards. They come out again tomorrow, and they're called the Freddie Awards.
Of course I am aware.
And you were a recipient 2 years ago, excuse me, of a Freddie Award, because your production of Silent Night that I saw in Washington was outstanding.
Thank you.
And yes, you're stage directing, and yes, the work of art itself, but the team that you put together, the costumes, the lighting was incredible, and the set design.
Yeah.
Basically, you have three languages. You have German, you have, am I remembering correctly, French and English, and there was Scottish.
Yeah.
And
you also
the
have
way
Latin.
we came to understand the three peoples in these crowds on the stage, but everything was always very clear.
Yeah.
And that's not easy.
Thank you. But like you said, it's the team, right? I mean, those are brilliant, brilliant designers. Erhard Rome, absolute genius, scenic designer. Robert Warzel, the lighting designer, who is working with me frequently, and Vita Tsikun, who's the costume designer in this case, but is a phenomenal scenic designer and production designer. So I was really lucky to work with them. And it all started in Wexford. It's all very special and dear to my heart. When I think about my career, it culminates. The pinnacle is Silent Night in Wexford Festival in 2014. It's the most special thing I've ever done. And it's a piece that speaks to me very deeply.
And Wexford is a wonderful festival. I've worked there, and I agree with you. So I'm mindful of the hour. And the other piece you put on your list, sorry, was Salome.
Yeah.
And a recording that I selected from the Adagio catalog is conducted by Eric Leinsdorf and stars Montserrat Caballé, and she said that that was her best recording of any opera she did. Regina Resnick, James King, and Cheryl Milnes.
Excellent.
And there's a very famous and completely true story of Eric Leinsdorf conducting Salome at the Met. I don't know if you know it. In the opera, there are 5 Hebrews, 5 Jews, and they're called 5 Jews, 5 Hebrews.
I love that story.
And at a certain point, he rehearsed the 5, as he called them, Jews on the stage. And he put down his baton and he said, okay, all the Jews can go, and half the orchestra left.
I love that story. And you know, our music director, Maestro Arthur Fagan, who is a mensch,
yeah,
Jewish, his parents are survivors of the Holocaust, Schindler's List, conducted that. And we would often tell that story at rehearsal. It's such a great piece, and we had a great time on it.
And with that, Tomer Zvulun, all the Jews can go.
All the Jews can go. Fred, I adore this conversation.
Thank you.
Let's connect in different ways. I look forward to having dinner with you. Thank you.
It would be a pleasure in Atlanta. I've been waiting to come back, or of course, New York. I do want to mention that the next 2 weeks are the end of the year for my series on Adagio, not the end of my series. We have people in the new year. But being Fridays on Christmas Day, I know already what we're going to have. Christmas Day, we will be doing Silent Night, not the opera, but the history of the song of Silent Night. And I will have guests in Salzburg who will, I hope, sing the song in the place where it was first sung in 1818. So mark your calendars for December 25th. And I was asking myself, who do I want to start the new year, January 1st of 2021, to be done with 2020? And I am looking forward to having as my guest the fantastic Frederica von Stade.
Oh, wow. Good for you.
So in the meantime, Tomer Zvulun, thank you. And my best wishes to everyone listening, and we'll see each other again.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Fred.